Mushroom season is not over, and in fact, there's not even a true mushroom season because fungi appear in all months of the year, in every shape and size and colour, each one offering a glimpse into the hidden worlds beneath our feet. January is often seen as a dormant time in nature, but it's surprisingly rich in fungal life for those who pay attention. While much of the landscape is covered in a blanket of frost, hardy fungi like jelly ear and oyster mushrooms and velvet shanks thrive in these winter chills. These winter walks have a stillness about them. The late afternoon light fades quickly, painting the woods in soft blues and pinks. Crispy fallen leaves crunch underfoot, and the call of a blackbird, or sometimes the soft hoot of an owl, will break the quiet. This is a great little patch. It's got jelly here and velvet shanks all growing out of it. Velvet shanks are one of my favourite and most reliable of winter mushrooms. Their bright caramel coloured caps bring a pop of warmth to the otherwise dreary surroundings, and they're surprisingly hardy for such delicate looking fungi. They're an awesome find for foragers at this time of year, with their firm texture holding up really well in soups and stews, and their delicate flavour adding a subtle but earthy sweetness to winter dishes. You'll usually find velvet shanks growing in dense clusters on dead and dying hardwood trees like oak, elm or ash. They're incredibly resilient, even surviving those freeze-thaw cycles that can knock so many other fungi out of season. Their caps can range between 2 and 8 cm across when mature, starting out convex and gradually flattening as they age. When they're wet they are viscid, which means that they feel slightly sticky to the touch, but on dry days they develop a much softer and matte feel to the cap. The colour is striking, with a glossy golden orange centre that fades to lighter oranges or yellows near the edges. If you peek underneath the mushroom, you'll see the gills. These are creamy white to pale yellow, tightly packed and adnate, meaning that they attach to the stem. The stipe or stem is what gives these mushrooms their common name of velvet shanks. The top part is smooth and pale, but it darkens towards the base in an ombre effect, turning a deep brown or black with a distinct velvety texture. While the caps and upper stems are great for cooking, the lower stems tend to be too tough and fibrous once they're a little bit older, but they're a welcome addition to stocks. Without a doubt, the funeral bell or Gallerina marginata is one of the most important mushrooms to learn how to identify before heading out foraging for your velvet shanks. This species is highly toxic and contains deadly amatoxins, so being able to recognise it is absolutely vital. Funeral bells grow on decaying wood, and they can sometimes resemble edible velvet shanks. The caps of funeral bells are usually brown to caramel coloured, and they tend to look a lot more vibrant and shiny when they're wet. The gills are a pale brown when young, but darken to a rusty brown colour as the mushroom matures. It has a rusty brown spore print, and the gills are adnate, meaning that they attach directly to the stem, and in some cases they might even run slightly down it, what we call decurrent. One of the most distinctive features is the stem. Depending on how old the mushroom is or the weather conditions, the stem can range from a pale tan to a darker shade of brown. Younger mushrooms often have a delicate ring called an annulus on the stem, which can be a helpful clue too. However, this ring does tend to disappear as the mushroom ages, so it's important not to rely on just that one feature alone. Always double check the key features such as the cap texture, the gill attachment, the stem details and the spore colour to make sure that you're picking something safe to eat and not a toxic lookalike. My oh my oh my oh my, look at these jelly ears. With their ear-like folds and gelatinous texture, jelly ear mushrooms are almost impossible to mistake. These weird little fungi thrive in damp, shaded corners of woodlands and have a particular fondness for elder trees, though they can sometimes be found on other deciduous species like ash or sycamore. Jelly ears can range in size from 2 to 10 centimetres or sometimes even 15 centimetres across, and their shape is unmistakably auricular, meaning they look just like a human ear, complete with folded, wavy edges. Their colour varies from reddish brown to dark brown, depending on how the light hits, and they become much more translucent when wet and darker as they dry. The texture is another giveaway. Fresh jelly ears feel gelatinous and rubbery, like a gummy bear, while older ones turn dry, brittle and hard. If you run your fingers over the outside, you'll feel that it's quite soft and matte with tiny raised bumps, while the inside is smoother, shinier and wrinkled. These mushrooms have only a faint earthy scent, but their habitat gives them away. Jelliers thrive on dead wood, especially elder trees, and are most prolific in winter when bare branches make them really easy to spot. To harvest, you just have to pull them gently by hand or use a knife for larger clusters. They're best when they're fresh and plump, but you can also pick them when dried and rehydrate them later. They can be cooked both fresh and dried, and they have a slightly chewy but crunchy texture. They're a common ingredient in ramens and stir fries. Be careful if you plan on frying them. The high water content means they have a tendency to spit back at you. The closest lookalikes are the cup fungi or Peziza genus, but these tend to be a lot more brittle and grow in an upwards cup formation rather than the downward hanging habit of the jelly-ear fungus. An easy way to remember it is that jelly-ears listen to the ground, whereas Peziza listen to the sky. Jelly-ear mushrooms are low in calories and high in fibre, and they help to support digestive health. They also contain small amounts of protein and are a good source of minerals like iron, potassium and magnesium. Jelly-ears are used in traditional Chinese medicine for their cooling and moistening properties. My acupuncturist has a big jar of dried jelly-ear in his apothecary, and they're believed to support blood circulation, improve lung health and promote overall vitality. Jelly-ears have been found to contain polysaccharides, which have immune-boosting and anti-inflammatory effects. They may also have the potential for lowering cholesterol and improving heart health. One of my favourite jelly-ear recipes comes from the inventive forager Fergus Drennan, who dries the mushrooms and rehydrates them in a juice or flavoured liqueur and dips them in chocolate to create a wild version of a Turkish delight. Oyster mushrooms belong to the Pleurotus species, and in the winter months you'll often find an abundance of Pleurotus austriatus. These mushrooms are saprotrophic, which means they decompose dead wood, primarily found on hardwoods like beech, oak and maple. They have a beautiful convex cap with inrolled margins when they're young, and as they mature they flatten out and become fan-shaped and have a kind of wavy edge to them. The colours can range from grey to tan or brown, and some even showing darker hues or hints of blue depending on the growing conditions. The gills of oyster mushrooms are decurrent, which means they run down into the stem. These gills are densely packed and creamy white to off-white, and if you run your fingers along them they can resemble the pages of a book. Oyster mushrooms produce a white spore print. The stipe or stem isn't always present, but when it is, it's usually off-centre and tough, helping the mushroom anchor itself securely to its substrate. It can sometimes seem as if there isn't a stipe at all, but it's often just buried within the substrate. The flesh is firm and white with a mild, pleasant, mushroomy smell. Oyster mushrooms grow in dense clusters, often resembling little shelves on the sides of trees. They stand out in the wild and are relatively easy to identify. That being said, there are a few lookalikes to be aware of. Angel wings, for example, are a potentially toxic mushroom, but the flesh is much thinner and more fragile than oyster mushrooms. Olive oysterlings are another lookalike, but the caps of these have a greenish hue, and the gills have a tint of yellow to them that matures to a brown. Olive oysterlings need to be well cooked before eating, and in some people they can still cause a bit of stomach upset even after cooking. Probably one of the most fascinating things about oyster mushrooms is their carnivorous nature. They prey on tiny soil-dwelling roundworms known as nematodes, supplementing the nitrogen intake. The oyster mycelium produces a volatile compound called 3-octanone, which acts as a toxin to paralyse nematodes by disrupting their cell membranes. Once these nematodes are immobilised, the fungal hyphae, the thread-like structures of the mycelium, penetrate the nematode's tough outer surface. The hyphae then release digestive enzymes that break down the nematode's internal tissues, allowing the fungus to absorb nitrogen and other nutrients directly from its prey. Oyster mushrooms have also been used to help clean up oil spills through a process called microremediation. Their enzymes are capable of breaking down hydrocarbons, the main toxic components in oil, into harmless compounds. Scientists have worked alongside mycologists and used oyster mushrooms to clean up diesel-contaminated soil. Over time, these mushrooms not only broke down the toxins, but transformed the soil into healthy, fertile substrate. These mushrooms have a really mild but earthy umami flavour with a really firm texture that holds up beautifully when cooked. Oyster mushrooms are some of the easiest fungi to cultivate, and aside from the slightly less than legal experiments that I had growing under my bed as an art college student 18 years ago, the Pleurotus genus was the first that I successfully cultivated at home. Since then, I've grown kilos upon kilos of edible mushrooms in my garden using lots of different methods. In my vegetable beds, I add mushroom spawn to wood chip mulch, which not only produces mushrooms, but it also enriches the soil for other plants. I've also grown oyster mushrooms in straw towers by layering straw with mushroom spawn to create vertical gardens of fungi, and I've grown them indoors using mushroom kits too. If you fancy trying to grow your own oyster mushrooms, next time you find a wild patch of oysters, keep the stem butts, add them to a wet piece of cardboard and roll them up like a burrito. Keep that somewhere fairly warm and dark for a few weeks. You should notice little tiny fluffy white patches, which is the mycelium. Once this cardboard is completely established or colonised, then you can transplant that into your next lot of substrate such as your wood chip or your straw beds. The flavour can actually change depending on what they're growing on. I found that the oyster mushrooms grown on the field maple stump in my allotment garden had a sweetness that was so different from the oak stump mushrooms that I found growing in the nearby woodlands. It's one of the things that I love most about foraging, that everything's shaped by its environment.